Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer and this is The Hunt for Nazi Spies in Ireland. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the Irish Free State government adopted a policy of neutrality. Now, while this ensured Ireland was not invaded, numerous Nazi agents were smuggled into Ireland to gather intelligence and develop contacts with the IRA, who shared their hostility towards Britain. Therefore, during the war, Irish military intelligence had to launch a relentless pursuit of these spies. Often cooperating with British counter-espionage, this was a highly successful operation as they captured all known German agents who landed on the island. Now, in this episode, I interview Marc McMenamin, the author of two books, Ireland's Secret War and Codebreaker. Marc has researched and written extensively on Irish efforts to counter Nazi operatives in Ireland during the war. So in this show, he explains this fascinating story, how the IRA were entangled with the Nazis, the often comical attempts by the Nazis to infiltrate Ireland during the war, and the forgotten story of Irish codebreakers as well. But I began the interview by asking Marc to explain who exactly Irish military intelligence were. They're often referred to as G2, but their history is not that well known. As Marc now explains, it emerged from the intelligence division of the IRA in the War of Independence.
It essentially forms out of the nucleus of the intelligence section of the IRA from Michael Collins. It goes through various iterations. It really comes into its fore, though, then when we're looking at the Second World War, because up until that point, you don't really, I suppose it's when the common enemy comes along. That is Nazi Germany and kind of the looming clouds of fascism, as I would say, in Europe. Up until that point, pretty much like a lot of the focus with the people in the army is kind of looking at Britain. You have to remember it's 20 odd years after the War of Independence, the Civil War, coming up to when you come up to the period of the emergency. So the focus isn't really there, on what we call external threats to the state, to the nascent Irish state. And the person that really kind of sees the woods from the trees really on this is Dan Bryan. And in the mid-30s, he senses what's going on in Europe, what's going on the continent. He sees kind of what's happening with Mussolini, what's happening with Hitler, the rise of fascism. And he senses almost immediately this can be a threat to Ireland, from a security point of view, which is very prescient of him. He's really ahead of his time here, and he's kind of quite alone in the army and in the government on this. He's really quite ahead of his time. So the crucial thing about Bryan as well is, as a character, and if we look at kind of intelligence as a whole up until the outbreak of the war, is that he was an excellent intelligence chief in that he kept in with people that he might necessarily have been friends with, people that were on the opposite side with him in the Civil War. So he had a good working relationship with people that were anti-treaty Republicans. Everyone kind of respected Dan, and because of that, he was able to kind of put together, see the bigger picture that we have this looming threat of fascism. We have disgruntled elements in the IRA. We have the rump of the IRA, like that's still there, that didn't side with De Valera, didn't embrace Fine Gael and kind of free stateism and whatever else. And he senses that there could be a link here, right? And there could be a problem coming down the line. And Republicans probably could be used as a kind of a fifth column by Nazi Germany or by other foreign powers. And he senses the danger in that. And therein lies the problem, and thus that became the nucleus of what he was trying to achieve. He pens this memorandum, Fundamental Factors Affecting Irish Defence Policy, which was way ahead of its time. He outlined kind of all the strategic ways in which Ireland could be vulnerable to an attack, could be vulnerable to spies, etc. And it was quite alarming. And this eventually circulates in government, around various government levels. It circulates around members of the army, and it kind of awakens them just about in the nick of time.
So while Irish military intelligence had come to recognise the threat posed by the Nazis by the late 1930s, this was matched, however, by a growing interest in Ireland by German intelligence. This often took the form of seemingly harmless cultural exchanges, but it appears they were seeking to cultivate relations with the IRA.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, it's not as if they suddenly just kind of developed this interest out of the clear blue sky. Like there's links with Germany that go back years and years, and there's always been kind of a German presence in Ireland. When you go back to the Ardna Crusher scheme, German thing, there was German labour involved in that, German engineering expertise. So the cultural links were always there. And in the 20s and in the 30s, especially when you come into the 1930s, the early 1930s, just as kind of Hitler comes to power, but before the outbreak of the war, that decade of the 1930s, you have cultural exchanges between Ireland and Germany. You have Germans who are traveling over here, doing courses in, various, mainly in the arts, actually, in Trinity College, but various different disciplines. Some of them come over to study folklore. I mean, there's a guy, Malthusen, he managed to make it as far as Donegal, where I'm from, to the Donegal Gaeltacht, But what was happening is when they were going to Irish-speaking areas and areas in the west of Ireland, some of these German students became acquainted with Republicans and with the IRA. Now, whether that was by accident or design, the jury is out on that, although, there are extensive MI5 files on some of these German students that came over, and they would have been members of political organizations, so it's highly likely that maybe, it was by design. Some of them always denied that, some of the German students that came over, but one way or another, there's connections there made, very tenuous connections, but relationships are built up, and one of those is Tom Barry, who becomes acquainted with some of the German students that come over here. But that develops, the IRA at this particular time is a kind of a tumultuous organization. It doesn't kind of really know its role. It's kind of its place. There's chief of staff changes several times in the IRA at this particular period. It all kind of comes to a fore of the period of the 30s. Eventually, when Sean Russell becomes the chief of staff of the IRA, it's then when it's probably decided by the Abwehr that there's an opportunity for Ireland to be used or to be exploited. Now, from what I've read and what I've looked at in various documents, their knowledge, I suppose, of what Ireland is really like on the ground is probably not the best in terms of the intelligence gathering that they had. They seem to have this perception that Ireland, that the IRA was kind of this rising army, like, that was going to just sweep the country, like, and help them as a fifth column. But really, it was kind of a ragtag bag of misfits, like a lot of them kind of were at odds with each other. They were largely in disarray. And that doesn't really change until Sean Russell comes in and you're looking at the S plan when they start targeting various cities in London and all that. It's then that they really see that there's an opportunity here to make some serious linkage here, because everyone knows the war is coming. It's kind of inevitable at this stage towards the end of the 1930s. It's only then when Russell comes in and Russell comes to the fore, he reorganizes the IRA into somewhat more a formidable force. He puts shape on the organization. And it's there then that they begin to really see them as an asset.
Our conversation moved through the 1930s, and Marc explained how the Nazis viewed Ireland by the outbreak of the Second World War and outlined some of their plans in relation to the island.
Well, you see, the thing is, there's various iterations of various different plans, and some of them have commonalities, some of them are different. One of the plans was this Plan Kathleen, which was to use the IRA to kind of create political instability in Northern Ireland, to give the Germans the pretense then to invade, to kind of defend the native Irish, and that was their in then. You had Operation Shamrock then, which was to invade the south, coming in kind of at Wexford there. So, I mean, ultimately what they want is this is all happening in the context of the Battle of Britain. You have to look at this because, you're just after Dunkirk. You are looking at the fact that the British have received an almighty bloody nose. France is gone, so they're standing alone and they're extremely vulnerable. So if they can open up a second front from Ireland and on the other side, it's a pincer style movement, when they're going to squeeze them from two sides. Now, how realistic that is, that they're going to be able to invade Ireland. There would have been air support, I suppose, from the RAF. They would have ultimately come in and defended Ireland. It's hard to know how successful it would have been. I would imagine probably not very successful, but that's what they're looking at ultimately. Now, that all changes then, of course, with the Blitz in London and how the RAF ultimately defend London. And then Operation Barbarossa, Hitler kind of changes his whole tactics anyway. Then, he opens the war on two fronts for himself, never mind trying to open it up on two fronts for the British. So there's a whole change in scenario then. But that would have ultimately been, that was ultimately where they were coming from.
During this period, multiple German agents landed in Ireland, Before we look at some of these individuals, Marc explains how a lot of their work was observational rather than actually carrying out acts of military sabotage.
The most important thing of all in terms of war, in terms of intelligence gathering, is the weather. I think most people, and myself included, up until I kind of studied this in more detail, you would think when you hear intelligence and spying and all that, they must be stealing top secret documents. But usually it's to get in and see what the weather is like, in terms of planning attacks and invasions. And in recent years, it's just shown how important that has been in Ireland in terms of the D-Day landings. There was some great work done by filmmaker Jerry Gregg a number of years ago, a documentary, Stormfront from Mayo, the Black Sod episode out there and all that. So it just shows you how crucial that information is. But also the land border as well with Northern Ireland there with the UK. I mean, it's relevant today. With you see it with Brexit. It was the same thing back then. They're close to Northern Ireland. They can get in. They can see troop movement in the north. Everything that's going on in Derry, for example. So there are various different reasons why they wanted to be in Ireland and have a presence in Ireland. And if the invasion, if a possible or fated invasion of Ireland wasn't going to happen or never happen, they were still very dangerous to have on Irish soil in terms of the intelligence that they could gather. Because if the Irish decided to share nothing with the British, that's, Dan Bryan decided to have a very good security relationship with MI5, with the MI5's Irish section under Guy Liddell. It was a total black spot for British intelligence. They didn't know what was going on right under their nose.
While we will look at some of the individual agents who reached Ireland later in the episode, Marc first explained what has become one of the more well-known chapters in this secret war. That was the visit of the IRA Chief of Staff, Sean Russell, to Nazi Germany in 1940. However, he would die on board a German U-boat as he returned to Ireland. But Marc now explains what exactly Russell was doing in Germany and his somewhat complex motivations.
Russell travels to Germany and he's trained by the Abwehr, in subversive techniques, with explosives and everything. And the idea is to send them back to Ireland, basically, in terms of aiding this kind of plan to invade Ireland, to give the Germans a context with which to invade and to uphold Irish neutrality. Because you have to remember as well, at this particular period, obviously there's the threat of German invasion, but Irish sovereignty as well, kind of in trouble as well, in terms of maybe perhaps a preemptive invasion from one of the Allied sides, to try and prevent, so you're kind of in trouble both ways. You're treading a very precarious line here. And there's an opportunity there, for Russell and them to exploit that. So, I personally, I find it strange with Russell. He's someone that kind of divides opinion with so many different people and so many different levels. I kind of find it hard to kind of criticize him in a lot of ways because, he seems to be kind of carrying on the Republican struggle that, up until not that long beforehand, a lot of the people that are trying to stop him were at the same thing, So he's a divisive figure. Like, even since my book came out, I've seen some people, some reviews, kind of criticizing Russell, some defending him, But the reality is he's there to be exploited by the Nazis. And I wonder, and I've wondered this, and there's no proof. There's absolutely no proof that Russell was anti-Semitic or anything like that. I don't think he was anything like that at all. But I wonder, was he extremely naive in who he was dealing with when he was dealing with the Nazis? And you have to weigh up the price then that you would pay for Irish freedom. I mentioned in the book that on Eichmann's list there of European Jews, Jewish people in Ireland are enumerated on that list. So at what cost would this have been worth it? So these are the things that kind of come to the fore when you look at Russell. There's kind of a lot of questions there. It's kind of lazy. I don't know if it's lazy, but just to say that he was an outright kind of anti-Semitic, kind of a Nazi supporter. I think there's a lot more to it than that. So I wouldn't take an opinion on either side on him, but I think he's a very interesting character. And sadly, someone that probably isn't studied as much as he should be.
I was keen to hear about some of the individual agents. Marc now explains who some of the actual people who were captured during the war were.
They sent over a number of different contacts. There was ultimately, I think, 7 or 8. One of the guys that was here was a guy called Werner Ultland, who was actually a sleeper agent. So he was actually here before the war, before he eventually awoke. But most of them, it was ridiculous kind of stuff. It was Keystone Cops kind of stuff. And, it begs the question, did they take Ireland seriously at all, or were they so stretched during the war that they were sending just complete idiots? Because it's some of the guys, it was ridiculous. There was one spy, a guy called Walter Simon, arrives in Dingle, and he ends up in the pub. Like he ends up in the whiskey, and he comes into the pub. It was Nelligan's pub. I was in it myself. I had to go in for a spy pint, you know. But he comes in and he slams the table with his fist. And I was speaking to some of the locals who heard the stories of this. And he slams his fist on the table and he says, "The poverty of Ireland will disappear when Hitler comes to power in this country." And I mean, you can imagine now, like in Dingle on a Friday night, like in 1930, this lad, Germanic voice, comes in and starts doing this. So it wasn't too long before this fella, like the special branch, were onto him and he was lifted. So this was the kind of thing that you were dealing with. Another German spy, a guy called Wilhelm Fried, bought himself a kind of a Cadillac, a real flashy car, and used to drive around Dublin and picking up girls. Like, so, you know, it wasn't too long before. And you have to remember, Dublin's a lot smaller place back then as well. It wouldn't be hard for you to stick out. Like,
as Mark continued, he began to conjure up a picture of more comical escapades than anything else.
Some of them were given pretty good instructions, but how well they carried those out now is a different story. You know, they got easily distracted. They kind of seemed to be on a party when they're over here, a lot of them. You know, some of them were to gather economic espionage. For example, there was one spy, Wilhelm Frietz, and their mission parameters would have varied from person to person. Wilhelm Frietz, for example, he actually went out and he spied on Baldadal, and he spied on some of the military installations. The quality of that intelligence, it's kind of arguable if it was any good, you know. Weather reports, weather information, they came with transmitters and they were trying to kind of transmit this information back to Berlin then. But G2 were trying to monitor the airwaves, you know, to see what was coming in terms of radio traffic. And they had several people who were kind of installed in various houses in Dublin trying to read the radio traffic to see was there illicit communications being broadcast over the airways. They didn't tend to venture into Northern Ireland, although towards the end of the war, some of them did. But there was a good working relationship then between, I suppose, the RUC Special Branch and then Dan Bryan and everybody else. The guy in charge of the RUC Special Branch has the best name I think you could possibly have if you were to be involved in catching spies. His name was Roger Moore. So I thought that was very funny when I came across that. That actually is his name. So Roger Moore had a good relationship with Dan Bryan, you know, with the various guys in the Garda Special Branch. And they kept pretty good tabs on all these guys.
While most of these German agents were arrested in the first 24 hours after they landed in Ireland, one in particular managed to evade capture for over a year. Mark now explains who Hermann Gertz was and how he managed to evade the Irish authorities for so long.
They were all lifted straight away within 24 hours, except for Hermann Gertz. Hermann Gertz was on the loose for nearly a year. Now, there's no real concrete, nobody really knows why that was, and there's a number of different schools of thought on that. They say that he just got lucky every time, like the special branch and military intelligence closed in on him, he managed to just kind of escape. Like, but then the other thing that the other theory that's out there is that Gertz was let loose for a little while just to see who he was talking to, and you know, most of the people in the IRA then that he was having any dealings with ended up actually being interned. So you know, the IRA were extremely annoyed with him because of that. So it's not entirely concrete, I suppose, how Hermann Gertz managed to stay on the loose for so long. But he was the only one. The rest were caught within 24 hours or so, and mainly out of their stupidity. It's amazing actually when you look at Hermann Gertz how he wasn't arrested. Like, there's stories of him. I mean, there's stories of him walking through Newbridge, you know, after he gets parachuted in full Nazi regalia, like, and asking for directions. Like, allegedly, he went into a Garda station in Wicklow and asked, did they know where the IRA was? Like, so these are the stories that you hear. I mean, how true they are, I don't know. How he wasn't lifted, like, apparently the guards in Palafuca give him directions, like, and sent him on his way, like, into town. So maybe they thought he was mad, I don't know. But you would wonder how he did come to the attention of people a lot sooner. They did make one attempt to try and arrest him in Temple Ogue, and he managed to escape, but he was caught then, almost a year later, he's caught in Clontarf. And it's actually funny, when he's caught in Clontarf, it's almost by accident. They were actually trying to raid another house, and they raided the wrong house, and they found him in it. Like, so it's a strange one, you know, and there's no real hard and fast answer why. But I would speculate, if it was my own opinion, I would say they probably let him loose for a little while to see who he was talking to, because, like, you know, ultimately, I don't think he wasn't a huge threat. You know, he was a threat in terms of the threat he could pose, like, but he wasn't the most, like, he wasn't the brightest button. And you know, he seemed like, from what I've read, and you look at, like, because he wrote a complete account of everything he did. You're like, he spent half his time womanizing, like, and going out in Dublin. Like people, from what I gather from reading, out in the nightlife in Dublin, people were like, "That's the spy." I mean, I came across, honestly, and I came across like a debate in the Dáil. I actually quoted the book because it's brilliant. I can't remember the name of the TD, but it was kind of a bit of sparring between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And the Fine Gael guy says, oh, he knows as much as the parachutist. So even they were kind of joking about it in the Dáil that there was a parachutist, the guy that had come down on the loose. So it's just a strange one.
The fact he managed to avoid capture for an entire year left me wondering who was helping him. A German living in Ireland during the Second World War would naturally draw down attention, so he clearly must have had local support in Ireland.
Yeah, like he was mainly put up by there was actually two sisters in Glenageary, the Farrell sisters, and they actually looked after him and he stayed with them. And they were kind of the support network. And then there was other people, various contacts in the Republican movement. I wouldn't say he's meant to have met up with one of the generals in the army, General Hugo McNeil. Yeah, so he's meant to have had a meeting with him. They said that two TDs might have met with him as well. This is kind of the stuff that comes out. There's nothing quite concrete on it. He's able to be on the loose, and he kind of goes around on the charity of others, and he's living off the back of that there are people who are willing to put him up and look after him. I mean, one of the places he stays with Issel Gan, Maud Gan's daughter. They put him up in the house, and there's some kind of evidence that he might have had an affair then with Issel Gan, and she put him up. I think Mark Hull discusses that in his book Irish Secrets. Excellent book on this period, that people should check out, as well as my own. Mark's done excellent research in all of this. So yeah, he lives largely on the charity of others and people putting him up. And he has those connections within kind of within the Republican movement that I'm like, they're not sympathetic to the German cause by any means, but they sense the opportunity here that it might be useful to help get back to six counties. So he knocks around within that milieu very much so.
While many of the German agents were captured through incompetence, Irish military intelligence had also developed a code-breaking team. Now, these people have been almost entirely forgotten by history, but Mark explains more about them now.
There wasn't any expertise in the army at the time to break German codes. And I mentioned earlier that they were watching the radio waves, to see were there any spies, people communicating, and they actually did hear illicit radio traffic, and it came from, surprise, the German embassy, the German legation. So they were using a transmitter there to communicate back to Berlin. But sure, they had no expertise in the Irish army to break codes, not at all. So Dr. Richard Hayes was a well-known intellectual, and he was the director of the National Library. They seconded him into military intelligence, and they gave him a code-breaking team made up of some civil servants, some actual members of Garda Síochána, and actually, very interestingly enough as well, a young Kevin Boland, the arms trial Kevin Boland, ends up this code-breaking team as well. The whole operation is so top secret that the young Kevin Boland isn't even allowed to tell his father, Gerald Boland. He's the Minister for Justice at the time. So it's incredible stuff. But Hayes has great success at figuring out how this code works. He doesn't eventually break it. But when the German spies come into Ireland, then they're carrying their instructions and their means of communication back to Berlin. It's all encrypted and it's all encoded through using ciphers. Hayes is very successful in breaking all of those codes. The code that Hermann Gertz is carrying, which later becomes known as the Gertz cipher, is an extremely sophisticated cipher. And Hayes breaks that. The guys in Bletchley Park actually come over to Dublin to see how to break this, because they're having some difficulty with it themselves.
Finally, as our interview drew to a close, I asked Mark about the overall impact of Irish military intelligence during the Second World War.
I think they played a hugely significant role. And I think people like Dan Bryan, Dr. Richard Hayes, there are many others as well, but take those two, for example. I think they played a hugely instrumental role in Irish history. And I think they've been sadly kind of left out of the historical record. I don't think people realise how pivotal a character Dan Bryan is in the history of this country in terms of keeping Ireland neutral and keeping Ireland out of the worst kind of excesses of the war. He kind of he walks a very kind of a thin line. It's a kind of it's like a tightrope, because he's sharing security information with the British because he knows it's the best thing to do, even though he has come from that. He's come from the revolution himself, and there's consternation within the army. They're disagreeing with colleagues about this, people that don't agree with what he's doing at all. But ultimately, he was able to kind of see above and beyond that, which was incredible for a man who was, he was a spotter on Baggot Street Bridge during Bloody Sunday. He was very much off the revolution. He knows that he has to do things this way because it's the right thing to do for the country. And to have that vision and to have that foresight and to think so far ahead, it's really incredible. I mean, internationally, when you're looking at intelligence operations, it's very unusual for any intelligence organization to kind of achieve nearly all of their outcomes. And G2, they did do that. They apprehended all the German spies that came here that we know of. There's a possibility some might have got slipped through the noose that Brian and his colleagues didn't pick up on. But anyone that came here that was a serious threat to Irish sovereignty, to the Allied war effort, they were all apprehended. And in terms of an intelligence operation that's run like with very little resources by a small crowd of guys, it's incredibly successful. I think he should be remembered for that. I think he's an incredible figure in Irish history. And I think I think De Valera makes his famous speech of Ireland standing alone at the end of the war, which I can understand why it was done. He's trying to justify our position in the new post-war world, kind of assert our independence, but it really doesn't do service to really what happened on the ground. And you have this incredible feat in terms of intelligence of what he did. You have Dr. Richard Hayes, who broke these German codes. He broke one German code that they came over from Bletchley Park to see how to break it. I think it's a tragedy that they're not better known. And I think the big impetus for me in writing the two books and writing Codebreaker and in writing Ireland's Secret War was that it might just generate a bit of a conversation about these two guys and about what they achieved, and might make people, look towards maybe that they might be, I won't say commemorated, but that they may be more part of the narrative of the Second World War. You look at schools and the way we teach it, like it's largely neutral. It's the Glimmermen and kind of rationing and things like that. There's a lot more going on, and I think a famous saying I heard once was that Ireland did everything bar send the troops to help the Allies. I think that would be fair to say. I think if more people talk about Dan Bryan and talk about Dr. Richard Hayes as a result of my two books, I'd be very happy. That's all I'd want out of them. Bryan and Hayes are both actually honoured in their own ways, which I always thought was brilliant. They brought Richard Hayes over to London. They kind of took him out for the weekend. They say that he got a medal. Haven't been able to prove that. It was a family member said that he got a medal, like kind of for helping out and all that, of Churchill, but I've never been able to find the medal or find out behind it. But Dan Bryan himself was brought up then to Derry, actually in civilian clothing, to witness the U-boat surrender in Derry. So the two of them were honoured in their own way.
I'd like to thank Marc for his time. His books, Ireland's Secret War and Codebreaker, are available from Gill Press. I have links to both of them in the show notes below. I would highly recommend checking them out. Until next time, Sloan.